What if the most devastating thing Prince William ever said about his brother wasn't spoken in anger, but in calm, deliberate certainty? Because this wasn't a shouted argument. It wasn't a dramatic confrontation in front of cameras. And it wasn't some emotional slip that could later be walked back. But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. This was colder than that. This was final. For years, the world has been told a familiar story. Two royal brothers drift apart. Different paths, different priorities, different lives. We were encouraged to believe that time would soften the edges. That distance would heal wounds. That, eventually, blood would outweigh bitterness. But what if that was never true? What if, behind palace walls, a decision had already been made, one that quietly erased Prince Harry not just from family life, but from the future itself? Here's the part no one wants to talk about. When Prince William reached this moment, he wasn't acting as a hurt brother anymore. He was acting as something else entirely. A man staring straight at the crown, a father thinking about legacy, and a future king calculating risk. And that changes everything. Ask yourself this. When someone has been hurt again and again, they react emotionally. But when someone stops reacting, when they become measured, controlled, and distant, that's when something irreversible has happened. That's where we are now. Because this announcement, this quiet but brutal line in the sand, wasn't just about what Harry did. It was about what William believes Harry represents. Instability, unpredictability, a threat not to the past, but to what comes next. And the timing is not accidental. Notice how the language has changed. Notice who stopped defending whom. Notice how silence replaced reassurance. That's not avoidance. That's preparation. Behind closed doors, there is a growing belief that reconciliation isn't just unlikely, it's dangerous. Dangerous to the image. Dangerous to the institution. Dangerous to the next generation. And here's the most unsettling part. This decision wasn't made in the heat of a scandal. It wasn't rushed. It wasn't impulsive. It was discussed. Wait. And then quietly locked in place. Which raises a terrifying question. If this really is a disowning, not in name but in practice, then why now? Why take a step so severe that it effectively rewrites the family hierarchy forever? The answer lies in a moment most people overlooked. A conversation that didn't make headlines. A shift so subtle that even royal watchers missed it at first. Because there was one sentence, reportedly delivered without emotion, that changed how everyone in that room understood the future. And once those words were spoken, there was no way back. Here's the part that almost no one understands. Families don't usually fall apart in explosions. They unravel in quiet rooms, over controlled conversations, when someone finally realizes they've stopped hoping. And that's exactly where this story turns dark. Because the moment Prince William made this decision, it didn't look dramatic from the outside. There were no slammed doors, no raised voices, no headlines screaming betrayal. In fact, if you were watching from afar, you might have thought nothing had changed at all. But inside the family, everything had already shifted. Think about this. When someone still believes a relationship can be saved, they argue. They explain. They defend. They get emotional. They fight because they care. But when someone stops doing all of that, that's when the door has already closed. At some point, William stopped responding as a brother and started thinking like a gatekeeper. Not of feelings, of access, of trust, of damage control. That's a dangerous mental switch, because once it flips, reconciliation stops being the goal. Containment becomes the goal. And the signs were there long before anyone wanted to admit it. The language changed first. Conversations reportedly became shorter, colder, less personal. Where there were once explanations, there were now boundaries. Where there was once patience, there was now distance. This wasn't punishment. It was withdrawal. And here's the uncomfortable truth most people don't want to face. William didn't arrive at this moment suddenly. He arrived slowly, after watching the same cycle repeat itself over and over again. Public gestures followed by private consequences. Apologies followed by new damage. Silence followed by escalation. Ask yourself something honestly. How many times can someone protect you before they decide you're the risk? Because from William's perspective, the role had reversed. The brother he once shielded had become the variable he could no longer control. And for someone preparing to inherit an institution built on predictability, that's not just frustrating. It's unacceptable. there's also something else people underestimate. William isn't just thinking about himself. He's thinking about his children, about a future where every unresolved conflict becomes a vulnerability, about headlines that haven't even been written yet. This wasn't about revenge. It was about prevention, which is why the most chilling part of this chapter isn't what was said. It's what wasn't. There was no attempt to negotiate. No conditions offered. No, if this changes, then maybe. The absence of bargaining tells you everything. When someone no longer tries to fix the situation, it's because they've already decided it can't be fixed. And that realization didn't come with anger. It came with clarity. But what finally pushed William from emotional distance to absolute finality wasn't a single public scandal. It was something far quieter, something discussed away from cameras, something that reframed Harry not as a problem to manage, but as a line that could no longer be crossed. And once that line was crossed, the wording changed forever. Because what came next wasn't emotional. It was surgical. Here's the question no one wants to ask out loud. When does protecting your family mean protecting yourself from them? Because that's the moment this story crosses a line most people never see coming. By the time Prince William reached this phase, the issue was no longer emotional fallout. It wasn't about hurt feelings, bruised pride, or even betrayal in the traditional sense. Those things had already happened. They had already been processed. And, in some ways, they had already been buried. What replaced them was something far more dangerous. Calculation. This is where the narrative shifts from brother against brother to something colder and far more permanent. Because when you start viewing someone not as family, but as exposure, the rules change. Compassion becomes optional. Distance becomes strategic. And that's exactly what appears to have happened. At some point, Harry stopped being a personal concern and became an institutional one. Not because of a single act, but because of a pattern. A pattern that suggested unpredictability. A pattern that made future damage impossible to forecast. And for someone like William, that's the one thing you cannot afford. Think about it. A future king doesn't just manage today's problems. He inherits tomorrow's consequences. Every unresolved conflict becomes a liability waiting to explode at the worst possible time. And here's the contradiction that makes this so unsettling. William didn't move faster. He moved slower. He watched. He waited. He let silence replace confrontation. That's not hesitation. That's assessment. Because when someone wants to reconcile, they lean in. They reach out. They create openings. But when someone is deciding whether to permanently shut a door, they do the opposite. They pull back. They observe how much chaos happens without their involvement. And apparently, the answer was enough. This is where the word family stopped carrying weight. Not in an emotional way, in a functional one. Family, in this context, became a variable. Something that could disrupt continuity. Something that could compromise stability. Something that future advisors, future governments, and future generations would have to manage. And William's role no longer allowed for that kind of uncertainty. Here's the uncomfortable part. From his perspective, continuing to protect Harry didn't just risk embarrassment. It risked undermining authority before it even fully existed. It sent a message that boundaries were flexible, that loyalty was unconditional, that consequences were negotiable. And once that perception sets in, it's nearly impossible to undo. So the question became brutal but simple. Do you keep shielding someone who repeatedly creates fallout? Or do you draw a line so firm that it ends the cycle permanently? That's where this decision hardened. And when it did, the language changed again. No more emotional framing. No more references to reconciliation. No more hope disguised as patience. What replaced it was finality. This wasn't a punishment designed to hurt. It was a decision designed to last. And that's why the next moment matters more than anything that came before it. Because when the wording finally surfaced, it didn't sound angry. It didn't sound dramatic. It sounded resolved. And that single choice of words sent a message so clear that even those closest to the situation understood what it meant. There would be no coming back from this. But the most devastating part wasn't the separation itself. It was what that separation silently removed. Here's the part that should make you uncomfortable. The most powerful statements aren't the loudest ones. They're the ones spoken without emotion. Because when the phrase, "we disown you," entered the conversation, it wasn't delivered like an insult. It wasn't thrown like a weapon. It didn't come wrapped in rage or bitterness. It came calmly. And that's what made it devastating. In most families, Disownment is explosive. It's messy. It's emotional. It's the result of a breaking point where anger finally spills over. But this wasn't that kind of moment. This was colder, cleaner, almost administrative, which tells you everything you need to know. This wasn't about punishment. It was about erasure. To disown someone in this context doesn't mean cutting off contact entirely or pretending they never existed. It means something far more strategic. It means removing relevance, removing influence, removing access. It means rewriting the future in a way that no longer requires their presence. That's why this decision landed like a shockwave behind palace walls. Because once disownment stops being emotional and starts being structural, it becomes permanent. Ask yourself this. What hurts more, being publicly criticized or being quietly excluded from the future? Because that's what this really was. A quiet removal from the narrative. A decision that said, without saying it directly, you are no longer part of what comes next. And notice what didn't happen afterward. There was no clarification, no softening statement, no anonymous source walking it back. Silence. That silence is the confirmation. When powerful institutions plan to reverse a decision, they prepare the ground. They leak possibilities. They test reactions. They leave doors cracked open just enough to step back through later. None of that happened here. Instead, the messaging tightened. The distance became normalized. The absence became routine. And that's the cruelest part of all. Because disownment doesn't always look like exile. Sometimes it looks like being allowed to exist, just not matter. At that point, Harry wasn't being treated as a rebellious brother. He was being treated as a completed chapter, a risk that had been assessed and closed. A variable removed from long-term planning. And if you think this was done lightly, consider this. Every word in moments like these is chosen carefully, especially by people trained to understand the weight of language, especially by someone who knows that once he speaks as the future king, those words don't fade. They calcify. Which brings us to the most unsettling realization of all. This wasn't about anger. It wasn't about revenge. And it wasn't about winning. It was about ending uncertainty. And when uncertainty ends, so does hope. Because once someone decides you are no longer part of their future calculations, reconciliation stops being a possibility and becomes a contradiction. But here's the twist no one talks about. Disownment doesn't just remove someone from the future. It reshapes everyone else's role around that absence. It changes how power flows, how loyalty is defined, how silence is interpreted. And the consequences of that shift are only just beginning to surface. Because the most devastating impact of this decision isn't what it did to Harry. It's what it's about to do to everything that comes next. Here's the truth most people don't want to hear. This wasn't a family argument. This was a structural decision. And once you see it that way, everything suddenly makes sense. Prince William didn't wake up one day and decide to cut his brother off out of anger or spite. He reached a point where emotion was no longer useful, where hope became a liability, where leaving the door open created more risk than closing it quietly ever could. That's the part that hurts the most, because it means this wasn't done in a moment of weakness. It was done in a moment of clarity. Think back to the opening question. Did William erase his brother? Not emotionally. Systemically, Harry wasn't pushed out with force. He was phased out with intention. Slowly, carefully, and in a way that minimized chaos while maximizing control. That's not how people behave when they expect reconciliation. That's how people behave when they're preparing for a future that no longer includes you. And here's where the tragedy deepens. This isn't just about two brothers who no longer speak. It's about what happens when duty demands a sacrifice no one ever wants to make. When protecting a legacy means breaking a bond that once defined you. William didn't just lose a brother in this process. He lost the version of himself that believed family could exist outside the crown. And Harry didn't just lose access. He lost relevance. That's the quiet cruelty of this ending. There was no dramatic exile. No final confrontation broadcast to the world. Just a gradual realization that the phone no longer rings. That the conversations no longer happen. That decisions are being made without you because you are no longer considered necessary. Ask yourself this. What hurts more, being hated or being forgotten? Because disownment, in this form, doesn't scream. It whispers. It removes you so cleanly that history continues without needing to acknowledge the gap. And that's why this story feels heavier than past royal feuds. There's no promise of reunion baked into this one. No vague language about healing or time. No symbolic gestures waiting to be interpreted as olive branches. Only silence. And silence, when it's intentional, is final. So where does that leave us? It leaves us watching the end of a relationship that once symbolized unity after unimaginable loss. Two boys who walked behind the same coffin. Two men now walking entirely separate paths, one toward the crown, the other toward uncertainty. And perhaps the most unsettling part of all is this. William may truly believe this was the only way forward. Not the kindest, not the happiest, but the safest. Which forces the audience to confront a difficult question of their own. If you were standing where he stands, responsible for everything that comes next, would you have done the same? Or would you have chosen family? Even if it meant risking the future? Because once a brother becomes a footnote, there is no rewriting the chapter. And some decisions, no matter how carefully made, echo forever.